Welcome to our Social Justice Policy Summit. If you've been with us since earlier today when we first began a summit, thank you for being with us here. And if you're just joining this panel, welcome to the webinar, Hate Crimes Are Growing More Violent, Realities, Challenges, and Remedies. We're thankful to both German Marshall Fund and the American Bar Association for hosting this program. And we're also grateful to each of our co-sponsors, ABA sister entities, for their support in helping make sure that this particular conference is successful. We're thrilled to be joined by a number of esteemed panelists to have an important discussion regarding both the status of hate crimes in the United States, as well as the need for reform, whether it concerns the way we approach defining and prosecuting hate crimes or issues surrounding data collection and reporting. As many of you are aware, the incidence of hate crimes has in fact risen and has grown particularly violent for a number of marginalized communities around the country. That violence is disproportionately impacting oftentimes Brown and Black communities, as well as other historically marginalized groups. So for example, although African Americans constitute about 13% of the total US populations, they're experiencing almost half of all racially inspired hate crimes in the country. Similarly, since 2016, over the course of the last 4 years, the Latinx community has seen a surge of over 50% in terms of the incidence of hate crimes. Also, the Jewish American community, as well as Muslim Americans, are also experiencing disproportionate rates of violence relative to their minority status in the country. As I mentioned, there are persistent problems surrounding both the reporting of hate crimes by victims to law enforcement officials who may or may not actually categorize the crime as being bias motivated, or also persistent flaws when it comes to the reporting of those law enforcement agencies to the Federal Bureau of Investigations, which is the federal agency responsible for collating, analyzing, and publishing that data on a yearly basis. And so what we've done is actually convened a diverse group of experts with unique specialties, sort of pick their brains about what's happening and how we forge a path ahead. So to start the conversation, I'd actually like to talk to Brian. Brian, you've published a number of reports regarding the rising incidence of hate crimes. You've also spoken to the flaws in the current data collection and reporting regime. This includes reporting by victims to law enforcement, as well as law enforcement reporting data to the FBI. Perhaps you can help set the stage for us by laying a foundation and also sharing your recommendations for change going forward.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. What a wonderful panel, and once and for all, I can assuage my mother for having a law degree and not a medical degree by appearing again before the ABA. So thank you so much. A few quick things, and what I'd like to do is just show you some quick charts in color that I think lay some of these things out. So let's go straight to that. I hope folks can see. Can you see this homicide chart? Is that visible to everybody? This is the latest FBI hate crime homicide chart. Now, the FBI relies on voluntary compliance from the over 16,000 law enforcement agencies, and we actually had a decline, I think about 4%. We had about 450 agencies or so that in 2019 did not participate. But even so, we had an increase in hate crimes, and in particular, we saw a record in hate homicides. However, warning, there are various exclusions. The Pulse nightclub massacres not in there. For instance, the Charlottesville homicide is not in there. And indeed, Mr. Jabara's homicide, also on August 12th, as my friends from AI have pointed out, was also not counted. That being said, look at that record, and what that means is, even without that horrible El Paso massacre, we still would have had a record in FBI hate crime homicides, which oftentimes are a bit incomplete. But it's not just homicides. Look at this, assaults. And this is what I thought was so interesting. Even among groups, and these white supremacist fatalities, rather, have increased every year for the last several years. So it's getting more violent, but also let's look at trends over time. I know I'm going through this a bit fast, but don't worry, there's going to be a resource book, and I will tweet at Prof. Levin after this, our latest report, which has most of these charts. But if you look, bottom line is, over the last 5 years, almost every group has seen an increase. But more importantly, look at this chart, month by month, hate crimes overall. And what you can see is that around political events, look at that. October of 2018, before a conflictual midterm, November, that's another box one. Election month, last presidential election, not the most recent one before that, that was the highest in about 14 years. And so if you look also, Charlottesville, that was another one. And in particular, and just humor me a second. If you look at specific groups, what we find is a carousel. So even sometimes when overall hate crimes have gone down, hate crimes against certain groups have gone up. Look at this. When we came out with a preliminary study back in 2015, showing a tremendous increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes, this is the response I got. So bottom line is, we've seen an increase over the last several years, not only in hate crimes, but how violent they are. Person-directed crimes have increased, assaults and aggravated assaults, and more importantly, even among groups where we've seen declines, we are seeing increases in the violent type of hate crimes. So that's very disturbing. And in particular, we are now seeing this overlap where these domestic terrorist massacres, which are occurring with disturbing regularity, actually impact the overall hate homicide numbers. So bottom line is, what we're seeing is an increase. Unfortunately, not everyone's stepping up to the plate. Alabama reported 0 last year, and out here in California, for instance, we also had Anaheim, one of the 10 largest cities in the state, reporting 0. So we have quite a few large cities reporting a minimal number of hate crimes. In addition, we are seeing some divergence between the local numbers, which are reported locally, as opposed to the FBI numbers. So for instance, we had almost 40 hate crimes in Philly last year, according to the local data, but in the FBI, it showed about a dozen. For the first time, most recently, the Bureau of Justice Statistics has shown that the majority of hate crime victims are in fact reporting, a bare majority, but this is good. But we are not seeing the kind of response that we should in states that have hate crime laws, and in the states that don't, like South Carolina, for instance, and Arkansas, and Wyoming has one, but it's very bad. We're not seeing these kinds of prosecutions. And one other thing, even in places where you think things are hunky-dory, like Los Angeles, just today, the newly elected district attorney in Los Angeles County is not going to file hate crime charges against defendants who beat transgendered people because they are not prosecuting enhancements at all in this new trend towards non-punitive prosecution. However, the problem with that is the United States Supreme Court in '93, in a case called Wisconsin versus Mitchell, where I had the opportunity to write a couple of amici briefs, the model statute is a sentencing enhancement one. So bottom line, at a time when we need greater enforcement, we're hitting speed bumps with regard to states that don't have hate crime laws, or even in states that do, we're finding minimal prosecutions, and that's a problem. So I think the Bar Association, both nationally, but also in each county, can do a better job reaching out to victims and also reaching out to judges and the bar community to say that this is a priority. We're seeing instances where prosecutors and even judges are not aware of the hate crime laws or the judicial laws in these various states. So I'm going to leave it at that because I want to make sure we have time for our other panels and for questions. But the bottom line is we've seen an increase. 2020 is going to be very interesting. We've seen increases in every election year going back to '92. But most of the times, these increases take place in the second half or the last quarter of the year. And that's been true for the last couple of elections. This year, we saw in many, but not all cities, a decline in the first part of the year, for instance, in places like New York. But southern cities, for instance, Los Angeles, Phoenix, San Antonio and Dallas, San Antonio and Houston, we've seen increases. But unfortunately, until we get the full year data, not the preliminary stuff, we're not going to have a great idea. I do think we're in a bit of an eye of a hurricane because most hate crimes, except for the top category, which is residences, occur at public gathering places, parking lots, stores, houses of worship, things like that. And we are looking forward to having a new administration come in because listen to this. We've had 3 consecutive years of 7,000 plus hate crimes. We haven't seen that since 2008. And indeed, 2019, which is the latest data we have, was the worst year going back to 2008. 2020 is a little different. Because public gatherings have been constricted, we saw declines in many cities, but we're also getting reports, some anecdotal, some not, of increases around this election time. Interestingly enough, when we see red to blue flips, the hate crimes usually accelerate in the run-up to the elections. We saw that in 2008. We saw that in 2018, and we appear to see it in 2020. But I think that we might, in some places, actually not get great data this year because of COVID. But what we have seen is, for instance, anti-Asian hate crimes go up significantly. In March and April alone, in various cities, we saw more anti-Asian hate crimes than the total for whole years in previous years. And it looks like in New York, for instance, we'll have a record. We saw increases in New York City, San Francisco, San Jose, and elsewhere. In 2019 as well. And I thought this was interesting. You know, hate crimes don't go up and down exactly in step across the country, but the 3 largest cities, New York, Chicago, and LA, at least from our data, hit nearly 2-decade highs. So we're concerned that when the pandemic ends, this kind of coiled spring will flip out. So we're concerned about that, and a variety of social science data, which I can get to maybe in the Q&A period. But I want to thank you all for having me. I think we have to look at states enacting hate crime laws and then enforcing them, having networks, both regionally and nationally for this kind of stuff. And one last thing, at a time when we saw hate crimes hit their highest levels in well over a decade and the violence increasing to either 2-decade highs or record highs, guess what happened with the Justice Department? Over the last 3 fiscal years, we saw a 38.5% decrease in federal prosecutions. And it's really important because there are some circumstances, particularly in these domestic terrorism cases where we don't have a DT law, to use the existing hate crime law, the Shepard-Byrd Act, and I would like to see it be used more. Also, the Jabara Hire No Hate Act is an important act that we need to have passed nationally. The bar can play a significant role both nationally, but in the local communities at the county level to serve as one of the collaborators for peace that we must put together with mayors and police officials, community leaders, and others, because we want to have a bridge, a liaison, so that victims can report. And again, remember, many crimes that we think are hate crimes were not necessarily labeled as such as the murder of Blaze Bernstein here in California, or for instance, the terrible homicides in North Carolina against the 3 Muslim grad students. So there's a lot of work to be done, but hopefully what we can see is a revitalization of the Justice Department's prosecution unit, the Civil Rights Division, and the Community Relations Service, which does mediation. Anyway, thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to a nice interchange with your audience and this wonderful panel that you put together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. So I'm actually really glad that you were able to highlight the experience of Asian Americans as well. We know that they have, in fact, experienced an increased incidence of hate crimes, which has largely been attributed by Asian American leaders and advocacy groups to the political scapegoating by a number of our elected officials of the pandemic, and some of the inflammatory rhetoric that's been employed, for example, by outgoing President Trump, such as referring to the pandemic as the Kung flu or the Wuhan virus, and that in turn has exacerbated the social, political, and racial climate confronting specifically the Asian American community. And I think what's interesting is that while we've seen this sort of disproportionate level of interpersonal violence being experienced by marginalized communities, whether they're Muslim or Jewish, African American, Latino, or Asian American, a common thread across those diverse experiences is the common attribution by so many of these community leaders and community advocacy groups that the interpersonal violence is being caused in some part by inflammatory rhetoric, as well as prejudicial bias, prejudicial policies that affect these particular groups. And so, for example, with the Muslim American community, we've seen research that shows 1 out of 5 violent hate incidents confronting Muslims, Arabs, or South Asians often have in fact cited Trump or Trump slogan or Trump policy. The same state allegation has been made by the NAACP, for example, when they try to understand rising rates of anti-Black hate crimes. They've also pointed to the irresponsible rhetoric and policies of the outgoing President Trump, and so on and so forth. So I actually enjoyed your presentation. I want to get back to some of the points that you made, such as the decrease in prosecutions, as well as the Jabara hate crime. Before we do that, let's turn to our next panelist, which is Domingo Garcia. And just to note that all of you should have actually received a copy of the participant handbook several days ago. It's important because it not only includes the program agenda for tomorrow as well, but also a full copy of the bios for each of our speakers. So since we have a limited amount of time to engage in substantive discussion, I'm not going to provide a comprehensive bio for each of our panelists. Rather, I refer you back to the participant handbook, and you should have received a copy, and we've also provided a link in the chat box for ease of reference. So next, let's turn to Mr. Garcia, and thank you for joining us. We're honored to have you with us. So we know, Mr. Garcia, from the statistics that the Latino community has in fact experienced a surge in hate crimes over the last 4 years. Interested in hearing your observations regarding the status quo and the reform that's needed going forward.
Well, let me just give you, I have a very personal perspective on this, because I divide hate crimes between those that are officially sanctioned, government, law enforcement, or quasi-law enforcement, and then private hate crimes that we've seen. My mother comes from a little town named Puerto Ventura, Texas, which in 1919, the Texas Rangers rounded up all the Mexican-American boys, men, and adults from age 11 to 81, tied their hands behind their back, and shot them all in the back. And that was not that far ago. Many people realize about violence against African Americans through lynching, but in the Southwest, many Mexican Americans were lynched by the Texas Rangers and by law enforcement. That history has unfortunately continued, and we've seen that there's been many issues of law enforcement taking the law into their hands. We've had multiple Latinos killed, a la George Floyd, suffocated, shot on their knees, unarmed. And also we've seen private. I was in El Paso, Texas a year ago, a day after a white man drove all the way from Allen, Texas to El Paso, Texas. And he killed 28 Mexican Americans because they were Mexican. He went to a Walmart to kill Mexicans, and he wounded 40 something. I was there the day after, and I talked to some of the victims there at the hospital. Some who were wounded, some who later died. One of them, Coco Garcia, her husband, they had a stand for raising money for their soccer team, a little girl soccer team, and they were not able to support their bears. And when the government showed up, the coach got in front of them and took the bullets. Girls ran. Now that is not isolated. In Gilroy, California, that same year at the Garlic Festival, another man showed up looking for Mexicans to kill and killed 3 children. What we've seen is that has continued through various lesser degrees, people getting beat up, injured. And what we've seen is the rise of the sort of right-wing militia that has gone down to the border to protect the border from the brown hordes that are coming across, the rapists and murderers that Trump alluded to. And that's created problems all across from San Diego to Brownsville, Texas, as the quasi-militia people have started showing up to enforce and support Border Patrol and violating the civil rights of Mexican Americans and Latinos who live on this side of the border, as well as those immigrants that come into contact with them. We've seen that the rhetoric from the White House has intensified with the caging of children, which is again official in my terrorism, to the voter suppression. And then what we've seen recently has been these white militia groups showing up at some of our demonstrations and rallies, armed and making racist and bigoted statements, trying to provoke us into fights. Many times they're armed. I spoke to the director of the FBI. I told him that the main threat to American society today is not Islamic terrorism or ISIS or anybody like that. It's our domestic white terrorists who are training and preparing and believe that there is a second civil war coming, and it's going to be based upon racial lines. And that type of thought process has to be nipped in the bud. Just like we went after the KKK in the 60s and 70s, there has to be an effort by law enforcement, hopefully under the new administration, to start prosecuting these individuals. I just talked to the governor of Michigan yesterday, who there was a plot to kidnap her and kill her because they thought she stole the election. And the FBI just literally broke up that ring a couple of weeks ago. It's outrageous that that's happening in the United States of America. It's something you would expect in some third world country, but not here. The FBI data, I'm not going to repeat, but crimes against Latinos have risen dramatically at all levels in terms of hate crimes. The rhetoric from the White House that all Mexicans are rapists and murderers, that they're coming in hordes, that the caravans, and they're all gang members and narco cartels, and that whole picture where, of 60 million people here in the United States creates that sort of environment where you either have kids chanting "build a wall" at football games to people shooting innocent folks at a Walmart. And that atmosphere and that rhetoric has to be confronted. And we've been doing that both in the courts through political satire, going after the Karens of the world that we've seen that are making racist comments or against Latinos and Latinas in the community, to taking them on in terms of the elections. But it is an ongoing problem and something that we have not seen in a while. The open bigotry that we saw in the 40s and 50s, no Mexicans, no niggers, no dogs allowed, has been replaced by this sort of soft bigotry, but that is much more expressive now under Trump. It's the lids popped off and now they're out there. They just don't wear hoods anymore.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you want to conclude?
I think that's just the main. We need federal and state and local law enforcement to crack down on these domestic terrorists that are targeting people of color, primarily Latinos, and we see Muslims and Asians and African Americans to a certain extent. So that to me is what we as lawyers, what the judicial and law enforcement agencies can do to try to stop what we've seen as the harassment and the intimidation and the threats coming from the far right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I look forward to returning to some of those points. It's interesting to see how both you and Brian highlighted the role of domestic white terrorism, which is a subject that we did an entire webinar on last year, and when it continues to be of great relevance. Janine, I want to give you a chance to jump in. I know you've published extensively on this subject and have a unique perspective to share, so I turn the floor over to you.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the punishment of hate crime. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so most states, 47 states now have some sort of hate crime legislation. That doesn't mean that if you are targeted by hate crime, you have equal punishment, equal chance of having the offenders who targeted you punished. There's quite a bit of variation depending on where you were attacked. So the lack of remedy that you have available to you may stem from the ways in which the legislation operates. Some hate crime legislation is very carefully drafted. In other cases, it's not terribly helpful. But I want to concentrate most of my comments on the enforcement mechanism, because that's really where you see the difference between jurisdictions. We should be talking about the police and the prosecutors more when we talk about the efficacy of hate crime legislation. Almost all of the hate crime legislation that exists requires the support of police to identify perpetrators, to gather evidence of the crime, and the prosecutors to prosecute offenders. And there is significant evidence that shows that the vast majority of police law enforcement agencies are not even reporting hate crime, let alone gathering evidence and catching perpetrators. For instance, the latest report that Brian talked about that showed this increase, this 20-year increase in the number of hate crimes. In that particular report, 86% of the agencies participating said that there was not one hate crime that had occurred in their jurisdiction. So 100 pages of zeros, as it's been called, in some particular jurisdictions. So the implications of this failure to identify hate crimes are actually extremely significant. It means that targets of hate crime are unable to receive any type of relief that exists in society, that legislators have passed, that the majority of citizens report. And we know this from the problems with the data. Even the increase, the 7,000 plus number that we have gotten for many, many years, we know that this is an undercount. Other agencies gather statistics on hate crime, and the federal government does a victim survey that shows that in which victims reported hate crime, many, many more, by many-fold increases. So I want to emphasize that law enforcement, if they were willing, and again, given this summer's protest, we question the willingness of law enforcement to intervene in these particular matters. If law enforcement is willing, there's a lot that they can do. And with respect to hate crime legislation, there are things that they must do, and these are discrete tasks. They have to catch perpetrators. Perpetrators sometimes act as if they don't want to, they don't have any trouble being found. In some cases, they actually do hide the fact that they committed hate crime. This is very important for preventing a further victimization. One of the things that's not well understood frequently about hate crimes is that perpetrators, they don't just do one hate crime, right? They do a series of hate crime and sometimes repeat hate crimes against victims. So you really do actually need to catch the perpetrators. You need to engage in punishment of perpetrators, and you also have to provide some sort of acknowledgement, and this is a function that law enforcement can do if they are willing to do it, provide some sort of social acknowledgement that this is a significant crime, and that is an important function of law enforcement as well. Law enforcement in the vast majority of jurisdiction has not devoted the resources to bias-motivated crime that it should. If there are more police departments reporting zero crimes, that's not an improvement. And what law enforcement really needs to do is they need to develop institutionalization and practices around hate crime. So by institutionalization, I mean specialized police units dedicated entirely to the investigation of hate crime, prosecutors who are specifically trained in hate crime and handle all the hate crimes for the particular jurisdiction. That type of specialization, which we've seen in the past in particular jurisdictions, is rare and may even be decreasing. So part of the reason that I focus my comments on police is because though the problem, mass incarceration is a huge problem, police don't have to always focus on bringing the carceral state to bear in the punishment of hate crime perpetrators. And I'm happy to talk more about this, but in the ordinary criminal law, police provide a variety of functions engaging in getting perpetrators to cease and desist. And they could do that if they were willing to in the case of hate crime as well. Right now, that's not happening. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Janine. I appreciate your focus on the consequences of hate crimes. And I thought the observation you made about repeat offenders is interesting and one we should return to in terms of maybe addressing the issue of prevention, right? Sometimes we're we're focused on punitive measures and what should ensue after an incident has occurred, but preventative measures is arguably just as important. Next, Nadia, I'd like to turn to you. You work with the Arab American Institute, and your organization has done phenomenal work around this issue in so many different ways. And so I want to turn the floor to you and hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with all of my fellow panelists, and Professor Ball, I must say I love your work, and Policing Hatred was phenomenal. So very honored to be on this panel with you. So my name is Nadia Aziz. I work at the Arab American Institute. We represent about 3.7 million Arab Americans around the country. And we do a lot of work around policy on many issues, hate crime being one of them. And I think this conversation has been so phenomenal. My professional background has kind of touched in a lot of different ways of different aspects of hate crime. From data analysis with the Arab American Institute, I've done direct victim work with the Lawyers Committee, and I also train law enforcement and prosecutors on hate crime enforcement and the impact of hate. So I'm going to try to kind of pull all of these things together. First, one of the things I always say is hate is not new. I think everyone here knows that, but just because there's been this kind of renewed attention put on hate crimes in the recent years, I just always like starting off by saying hate crimes have been a part of our country since its founding. But what is different is that violent offenses have increased recently. This is 2019 is it's the deadliest year on record for at least the second year in a row. And we're seeing hate, and kind of, I hope to address some of the things in the question and answer as well. We're seeing it become more mainstream, a lot of these white supremacist movements. And the reason for that, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is on the role of online platforms and the role of public rhetoric and conversation. And so we are seeing efforts to make, white supremacy seem more mainstream, more than it already is. So for example, on Facebook or any of these online platforms, people can get around different community standards by, instead of saying white supremacy, maybe they say alt-right. And what they're doing is they're making it more palpable to others who may be, turned off by white supremacy or white nationalism. Similarly, in Charlottesville, instead of walking around in white robes and hoods, they wore khakis and polo shirts. Similarly, they're trying to show that, oh, it's not scary after all, and trying to recruit more members. And it's been quite effective. And of course, we've seen blatantly racist, inflammatory rhetoric and policies stemming from the president. And he has fanned the flames of hate throughout his entire presidency, making it very dangerous for diverse communities. So folks have already chatted about the data, but one thing I would like to discuss, specifically some of the research that AAI did. Brian mentioned two folks, well, he mentioned several, but the two I'm going to talk about are Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer. And I think it is incredibly important whenever we discuss hate crime to center victim stories and to center impacted communities. And so that's what I'm hoping to do by sharing some of these stories. So Khalid Jabara was an Arab American who lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He lived there almost his entire life. In, 2014, 15, a neighbor moved in next door to him and his parents. And this neighbor began harassing them almost instantly with anti-Arab slurs, all kinds of awful things. There are protective orders taken out. At one point, this neighbor ran over Khalid's mother, with his car. She was in ICU for months. She had to do physical therapy for months. It was very traumatic, as you can imagine. This neighbor went to jail, and he was out on bond. And less than a year after he hit Khalid's mom, he shot and killed Khalid on the front steps of his family home in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this happened on August 12th, 2016. This man, Stanley Vernon Majors, was charged with a hate crime He was convicted, but as Brian mentioned, this was not reported in the hate crime data. Fast forward exactly 1 year later, August 12, 2017 was the day of the Charlottesville violence in Virginia. Now, almost immediately, chaos ensued in Charlottesville, and things quickly went violent. A man rammed his car into a group of peaceful counter-protesters. And at trial, he admitted to saying he hit this crowd because they were racially diverse. And he was intending to hit a Black person. He did hit several Black people, but he ended up killing Heather Heyer, who was a white woman. Now, Alex Fields was charged with a hate crime, and I believe he pled guilty or was convicted. But either way, this murder was also not reported in the hate crime data. And so AAI discovered this in, I think it was 2018 or so. And we started doing more research, and all of this continues to ask the question, if these two high-profile hate crimes were not reported in hate crime data, what else isn't reported? And when you think about it, that's pretty scary, because the numbers are even beyond what we think. So when there's about 7,000 hate crimes reported through the FBI's UCR program, which is kind of through the law enforcement perspective and is not mandatory, compare it to the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is through the victim's perspective and is about averages around 200,000. That is a humongous gap in hate crimes that we're missing. And that's both because community members are not comfortable going to law enforcement in many communities, rightfully so. And because not all, not all law enforcement reported up to the FBI because it's not mandatory. So there's several gaps throughout this process that these can kind of fall through. But to these families, to Haifa, Khalid's mom, and to Susan Bro, Heather's mom, the fact that their loved one's death was not in the hate crime data is incredibly significant, because to them, it's as if their loved one's murder didn't count. The government didn't even see it. That's what it felt like to them. And when you speak to victims of hate crimes and victim families, often what they'll tell you is they just want their story. Well, first they want their loved ones back, but they want the story of their loved ones to continue on. And I have been honored to be able to work with a lot of these families where we're able to take them to different police departments for trainings, and they're able to share these stories. But to not have your loved one's murder even reflected in the crime data, that's pretty significant and painful. And so we worked with some members of Congress to introduce the Hala Jabara and Heather Heyer No Hate Act. This is bipartisan, bicameral legislation that was introduced a couple of years ago. On the House side, it was introduced by Congressman Beyer and Olson, so it was bipartisan. And on the Senate side, it was introduced by Senator Blumenthal. Excuse me. And what this legislation does is it provides incentives to improve hate crime reporting and data collection. So it allows for the Attorney General to provide grants to departments to help the departments transition into the newer, more efficient crime reporting system called NIBRS. And it would allow for these grants to be used to help the departments implement this new system and train them on how to accurately track and report hate crime data within the system, so it's more accurate when it gets up to the FBI. There are other portions of that legislation that are incredibly significant as well, but that's sort of the gist of it, is to provide incentives to improve reporting and data collection. Another thing I wanted to mention, and this particularly, well, actually first, before I have notes all over the place from everyone else's comments, but one of the things before I move on from the data, President Garcia spoke to the increase in anti-Latino hate crimes and Walmart specifically. And what was phenomenal to me when we talk about data being underreported, it's also misreported. So in 2019, the Walmart shooting and the federal hate crime data wasn't reported as anti-Latino, it was reported as anti-other. And so there's 22 murders that are anti-other, which is actually the Walmart shooting. So that's significant as well, because it's not accurately capturing the data against this community, the hate and violence targeting this community. Okay, I wanted to be sure to mention that. I'm just crossing things off. So another thing I wanted to mention, we talk a lot about hate crimes and conduct that meet the definition of domestic terrorism. And at AAI, we phrase it as conduct that meets the definition of domestic terrorism because in the US criminal code, domestic terrorism is in it for purposes of investigation only. So it is defined for investigation. It is not a separate criminal code. And there are some advocates that, of course, push for a separate domestic terrorism charge. Excuse me, AAI opposes a new charge, and I want to just briefly explain why. So this is a little nuanced, but I hope you can bear with me. Some of the arguments for a new charge are that, well, there's a charge for international terrorism, there should be one for domestic to kind of balance it out, the moral equivalency. Well, international terrorism is certainly different, but there are over 50 charges that are crimes of terrorism that can be applied to acts on domestic soil that are solely domestic. So there are over 50 charges right now that can be brought already. So the law is already there and already existing. Secondly, it would not address the problem at hand. If we're trying to fight the greatest threat, which is white supremacist violence, laws have been enacted specifically for that purpose. And those are called hate crime laws. And the first one was passed in 1871 as the KKK Act. I can go into the history of hate crime laws for a whole different thing, but the laws are there. There are really great articles written by former prosecutors, Kristen Clark and Roy Austin, who have discussed this as well. So it can be a little misguided there with the moral equivalency argument. But the other thing is, what we really need is prioritization from the top down and resource allocation to be correctly geared towards the target. Excuse me. One example that kind of shows how this can be so distracted is the FBI's creation of the Black identity extremism category, saying this new category of what they call Black identity extremist is a threat. If you look at the report, it's really absurd because it basically includes anyone who is proudly Black who protests police brutality, essentially. It's incredibly broad and really just ludicrous. But we know that the system is biased. And so when we think to how we can protect these communities, it's not to create another law. It's not to go against sort of the principles of criminal justice reform to create this law that in a biased system, we know how it would actually play out, which is it would harm the communities that are already most susceptible to this kind of violence in the first place. That's one thing I wanted to mention, and I'm crossing these off my list, so I'll go really quickly. One thing that hasn't come up, we talked about the need for law enforcement training. One issue that I think we can all, hopefully in the next administration, try to advocate for is addressing the issue of white supremacists in law enforcement. This has been a problem for decades and decades. There are plenty of FBI reports on it. But when we talk about communities reporting to law enforcement, first of all, if you have strained relationship with law enforcement to begin with, you're not going to report a hate crime to them. Secondly, if you fear that they might be engaged in some of this behavior, you're definitely not going to report to them. And so there's a lot of work that can be done around that as well, including just general community and policing task forces that I can chat about later. I think I might be getting close to or over my time, so I can wrap it up there.
Great. Thank you so much, Nadia. That was a really comprehensive presentation. And I enjoyed hearing the personal anecdotes and some of your suggestions as well. And the intersections with white supremacy are interesting across the different remarks. I realize that we're coming up at 3:30 Eastern time. And one of the fortunate aspects of being the last panel of the day is that we have a lot of cushion to go overtime. So if you remain with us, I'm sure it'll be worth your while. So our next panelist is Brandon Golub in California. Brandon, we'd like to hear your thoughts about the insights that your co-panelists have shared and recommendations for going forward.
Hi, everyone. I'll be brief because I know we are coming up on time and I already see a lot of great questions in the chat that I want to make sure they get addressed. Likewise, very thankful to be joined with all these distinguished panelists. And I actually feel as though it makes great sense that Nadia and I get to speak a little bit in tandem, because an aspect that she brought up at the outset was what I really wanted us to focus on in thinking about. Yes, hate is, of course, an age-old phenomenon. If I keep looking this way, it's because that's where she is on my screen. So if I say, hate is an age-old phenomenon, of course, but we also want to think about this very specific particular moment that we're in. And when we think about online hate and some of the translations between online hate and real world violence that can, of course, be measured differently and that can be thought about differently. But I want to make sure that we're thinking about this aspect that she brought up, which is there's been a number of conversation amongst our panelists about how the digital world gives white supremacists or white terrorism, domestic terrorism, here specifically in the US, a safe space to explore these extreme ideologies and intensify their hate without consequence. And when we look at hate in this specific moment versus hate in the past, extremist groups are able to quickly normalize their messages by delivering this seemingly never-ending stream of hateful propaganda to masses in a lot of different ways. And this has been written about and thought about. I know that we use these examples of, we could think of everything from, of course, the extreme examples when it comes to hate crimes, because that's what we often see in the media and that's what shapes popular consciousness. So everything from Dylan Roof and how he essentially self-radicalized online before he murdered 9 people at a Black church in South Carolina. There's a handful of examples from Robert Bowers, who committed murders at a synagogue, and he was active on Gab, which is an offshoot of a Twitter platform. So of course we could use numerous examples to think about some of that radicalism, but I also want us to be thinking about some of the micro considerations and the micro policy solutions around not just this mass mobilization of hate groups, but what some of these even smaller incidences look like, and what some of that violence can look like on the ground as well. I know that Angie brought up in conversation with Brian as well, even thinking about the rhetoric of Trump and thinking about his hate-filled speech and how that has been very specific in this moment related to COVID-19. And we could even look at his Twitter platform, which we know has been very unprecedented for our head of state, and just his numerous examples of calling it the China plague, as well as a number of other uses of rhetoric that have really normalized these hate-motivated violence, acts of hate-motivated violence. So I, of course, want us to be thinking on one level about how mass organization and how white supremacist groups can spread their messages. But I also want us to be thinking about how these social media spaces and these digital spaces, especially as our dialogue has been increasingly there since the COVID-19 pandemic, also help normalize so much of this rhetoric and help incite hate-motivated violence. And what I mean about some of those micro examples is, again, I know Brian and I are both here in Orange County, but this has been happening across the country. But here in Orange County, we saw just recently, earlier this year, an attorney who was running for Irvine City Council was on a Zoom, and she was specifically talking about pandemic parenting. And there was Zoom bombings and a red swastika that was flashed across the screen. There were other local examples of youth who at a local high school had created a swastika setup with red cups at a party and then had put salutes on social media. So I think there's so many layers of the different ways that we should look at it. And when we think about the policy solutions, and of course it can be hard to draw the line between hate incidences and hate speech and then what actually manifests into a hate crime for purposes of our panel. But as we think about tackling that from a policy direction, there have been some calls, and the ADL and elsewhere have taken surveys that have said, the vast majority of people say that there should be some content moderation or stepping in from these platforms. So we've seen attempts from Facebook, Twitter, other platforms, both recently and more historically, to attempt to moderate this content. And so we should also be thinking, though, about what that means for us as individuals in terms of flagging this content, reporting this content, and everything along those lines, because it is all so user generated. So of course we want to be thinking about some of those larger policy solutions that's also been brought up in conversation, and as a number of our panelists have talked about with law enforcement trainings at both the local and more national level, we want to be thinking about what does their digital training look like? How do they, actually look at and perhaps moderate and help with some of these conversations in the digital spaces? So yes, as has been noted, hate is of course an age-old phenomenon, but we're in this specific moment where technology gets used in very specific ways, and especially during the pandemic, increase in these dialogues. So I want to make sure that we turn it over to Q&A, but wanted to make sure that we do definitely think about so many of those online and digital discourses that are creating and fueling and normalizing hate-motivated violence.
Thank you so much, Brandon. We actually received a few questions regarding the role of social media, so I'm glad that you were able to inject that perspective into the conversation. So at this point, I do want to address some of the questions that have been posed by members of our audience, and I realize that we're a bit over time, but if you would indulge me, I think it'll be worth your while. So I guess broadly, this question from Daniel speaks to the issue of reporting and data collection, which to my mind seems like a persistent criticism of the current hate crimes regime and an approach that we have on both a federal and state level. Essentially, the question is the failure of police to identify hate crimes a function of police sympathy with perpetrators, lack of knowledge of hate crimes, or some other reason, including perhaps bias or whether explicit or unconscious in some manner? And I think that question is important because in order to make policy recommendations, we need to understand what the actual impediments are. The current system, as to my knowledge, does not incentivize local law enforcement officials to report hate crimes or to identify hate crimes, and nor I wonder if that sort of incentivization is possible, and it seems like it might make a difference. What do you all think? What is causing the underreporting? What factors cause underreporting? The lack of identification, proper identification by members of law enforcement agencies, and this has been an issue identified by the Department of Justice as well. Janine, you want to address?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think that rather than point to individual law enforcement officers, and I'm sure there are some, and there may be even more now as a result of the protests this summer, police officers tended to react with the feeling that they were victims as a result of the protest, as opposed to, taking the criticism. I would point to structures, right? Police departments are not organized in a way to adequately respond to the problem of hate crime. In part, that's because they're the head of the police departments or the head of jurisdictions may feel we don't want to admit that there are hate crimes occurring in our particular jurisdiction. Makes us look bad, makes us look racist. So we're not going to set up these units or engage on the part with prosecutors to really address this appropriately. These are also expensive. They cost money. And police departments may rather spend money on tactical or other types of equipment as opposed to creating structures that actually address hate crime.
Others? Thank you, Janine.
I mean, I completely agree. I also think it's kind of all of the above. When I've traveled to do these hate crimes trainings, I travel with the Matthew Shepard Foundation and the Lawyers Committee. And one of the things we always cover is data and reporting. And it's so interesting to hear how different departments document and report. But honestly, it seems like it's, for a lot of law enforcement agencies, it's just another thing in their list of things that they have to do. And so I think in that case, it's really from the top down. It's the chief setting the tone that this is a priority for our department. That can make a huge difference and go a really long way. But otherwise, I think it's just kind of another thing on their checklist of things they need to do.
And so Brian, did you want to address it?
Yeah, just real briefly, I think we're seeing a lot of the same problems that we had when I was involved in putting together hate crime trainings for the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in California 30 years ago. I think Nadia made an excellent point. Noble in the 1980s said a message from the top. So I think there are a variety of issues aside. Let's leave the bias stuff aside, but structurally, police are not trained to respond to motive, at least the line officer, in the way that others are, right? It's a specific intent crime that can also come from investigation. They have been trained to respond to crimes by level. Is it a murder? Is it an assault? Is it a burglary? That kind of thing. Message from the top is really important. And also, relatively speaking, even though we have quite a number of hate crimes, relative to run-of-the-mill crime, they're less common. So in certain jurisdictions, folks may not see them overtly as much as you would in more densely populated places where there are units and there are mechanisms, for instance, a 2-tier review process, which the FBI recommends. And unfortunately, not only training, but I really believe that many departments just don't want to participate. And that's, again, coming from the message from the top. As a former NYPD guy, I can tell you something. If the CO says something, whatever it is, make sure there aren't double parked cars, or make sure that you respond in a particular way to domestic violence, guess what? The troops follow. So the first thing is we have to make it part of the professional policing culture. And generally that starts with the larger jurisdictions. But there's a multitude of problems dealing with data collection and training and a lack of awareness of the laws that are in the state and actually what constitutes a hate crime. And again, the fact that when I see cities that are reporting a lot of hate crimes like LA and New York, I say bravo. And the cities like Anaheim, for instance, or Miami, which for 8 years didn't report a single one last decade, that's a problem. And one of the things that we're trying to do here in California is set up a permanent state of hate commission. So there's something foundationally and continuing to make sure that these departments are toeing the line. And prosecutors.
I would join in his comments. It comes from the top. If we have a Department of Justice and an FBI director, a new one, that sets up rules, regulations, and guidelines to all police departments, so when everything goes to the National Data Bank, that there'll be a check mark. Is this a hate crime or not? I think that would go a long way to try to unify a national standard for reporting hate crimes. Unfortunately, especially in southern states, they don't want to report those crimes in Texas or Georgia or Mississippi, and therefore there's almost an overt negation of even reporting those.
Great. Given the aftermath of this summer and that was characterized by racial injustices and social unrest, and research that evidences that unconscious biases and sometimes explicit biases is in fact a challenge confronting local law enforcement agencies. If police officers have unconscious biases where they view communities of color, Black and brown communities, as inherently suspicious or criminal or suspect, it's hard not to consider what the implications of those are when members of those same communities are actually victims of the crimes rather than the perpetrators of said crimes, right? And so it seems to me that, there's been a number of recommendations for trainings on explicit and unconscious biases for members of law enforcement officials in response to the incidents of police brutality, but I can't help but wonder if it's also a necessary component to this question of proper identification of hate crimes as well, being able to view these communities, whether African American or Latino or Asian American or Muslim, so on or so forth, as victims of crimes rather than consistently being the perpetrators of those crimes. So, related to the issue of reporting and data collection is underreporting by victims. And this is a question that was raised by several of our audience members. So we have the question of, proper identification and reporting on the local level, but then also the challenge of getting victims to actually come forward and report these incidents. What are your thoughts about overcoming those challenges? How do we do that? Particularly if the victims come from historically marginalized communities that may have problematic or undermined relationships with members of the law enforcement community. Janine, let's start with you.
One of the ways to deal with both of the problems that you raised, the victims reporting and officer bias, is to have specialized units. Specialized units composed of individuals from marginalized communities. I studied a unit that had 3 Asian language interpreters to deal with issues of community interaction. You can also use a specialized unit that has a relationship with victims advocacy groups in the community that can say to them, all right, if you hear of anything that has happened, you need to call us and be the interface between the individual who's been targeted and also the police department. Those are one ways of getting around those issues of difficult relationships with the police and also victims' reluctance.
That's a really wonderful recommendation. Janine, other thoughts or input?
I think this question ties very intimately to the one we were just previously addressing about lack of, as Brian pointed out, lack of conceptualization or misunderstanding of what are the dimensions of a hate crime, what constitutes a hate crime, and just as that impacts police's ability to witness it and to record it, it can also impact individuals' own understanding and conception of, I have been a victim of a hate crime, so what do I do next? So I think that it's often the solution we throw around, and we can think about it in a lot of different ways. But when we think about education, and a number of us coming from academic spaces and what that looks like, but I know that responses to a lot of this on the ground has been, for example, when there was that incident here in Orange County with the high school youth who created the swastika shape and then distributed on social media, the intervention very much looks like youth training programs to understand the history behind symbols, to understand what amounted to a hate crime again. So again, can be very community driven, very based off of the population that you're working with in terms of how we want to do these types of education. But again, comes back to our digital spaces, and over 50% of individuals reporting in that ADL report that they've been subject to some level of online hate, but lack of conception between, and definitional dimensions between, we throw around the words of, oh, this is just trolling that they were doing, or this is just cyberbullying, or this is some other type of hate incident. So I think it really gets back to that space of us needing to ensure that individuals are being educated about what constitutes a hate crime and what is the ability, what are the resources that are available for that.
There's got to be a chain, and that chain involves not only the police departments, but if you're dealing with it once the crime occurs, you've already lost the ball. Because what you have to have is something, for instance, in Orange County, they have a Human Relations Commission, and they're all being underfunded, and there's political stuff that goes on. But bottom line is we have to have some kind of structure where not only police departments are involved, but as we saw, for instance, starting under Reno, when we had these working groups put together by the federal Justice Department, but operationalized at each district, each federal district. For instance, and I think what we should look at as well is having some kind of structure where, for instance, if there's a liaison, if there's, for instance, a religious support group or some kind of constituency group that can serve as a liaison or a bridge to either government or police departments to get these reports into the system, particularly when there's cultural, linguistic, and other kind of fears. And one problem that we're having, and it's terrible, we are seeing this carousel, and just bear with me 1 second, we're seeing this carousel, and everyone who said this is exactly correct, and the data backs it up. This carousel of attacks on groups that are labeled as legitimate targets of aggression in the socio-political milieu. And the bully pulpit is really important. So when President Bush, a Republican, spoke at the Islamic Center of DC 6 days after 9/11, hate crimes dropped precipitously the next day and continued a downward trend into the following year. However, candidate Trump, 5 days after the terror attack on our community in San Bernardino, did his vile Muslim ban 1.0 proposal. Hate crimes against Muslims and Arabs jumped another 23% on top of the spike that occurred after the attack. Similarly, Charlottesville, the highest number of hate crimes that month were reported in the 6 days of and after the Very Fine People statement. We could go on and on and on about this. The data backs it up. So what I think going forward, we have to make sure that with a new administration coming in, which will have a more welcoming tone, a more tolerant tone, that goes also down to the local level. And I'll tell you, we have this carousel. A decade ago, it was Latinos. Then mid-decade, Arabs and Muslims. Then we had a substitution again of Latinos again. And then it was Asians. So it's important to nip that in the bud, because what we see is it's not only a catalytic event that can influence spikes, but how community leaders and the bully pulpit responds as well. And for undocumented people, this has been terrible. I would love to have different states cover immigration status in their statutes and to set up some kind of an arrangement that if an undocumented person reports a hate crime, that they're not going to be deported or they're not going to be further victimized, because we have so many obstacles with certain vulnerable communities, the disabled community, immigrant communities, religious minorities, and others, that we have to take that extra effort and not just put out a sign saying, eat at Joe's. We have to go into communities and make people feel comfortable and welcome, not only with services, but with law enforcement response as well.
And if I can just further elaborate on his comments, I agree. Many immigrants live in the shadows. They're afraid to report even regular crime, much less a hate crime, to law enforcement, because they're afraid that they will be picked up and they will be deported or separated from their families. So there is a large, probably undercount of Latino hate crimes, because if they're undocumented, they're not likely to report it to law enforcement or to hire an attorney or contact a civil rights group. So that is something that needs to be addressed, especially in those cities and states with large undocumented populations.
And we're at your service. You have a wonderful organization. Love what you've done over many years. And the consulates can play a role too, because sometimes victims are more comfortable talking to the consulate of where they're from, and we're working with folks from various consulates as well. So any way that we can reach out into these various communities in a creative way, thinking out of the box is critical. And we're at your service, sir.
Thank you, Brian.
Great comments. Even prior to the ascension of Donald Trump to the Oval Office, or his declaration of candidacy for the presidency back in 2015, social science data has long showed that political rhetoric as well as political events can in fact contribute to the incidence of bias-motivated crimes. So, what we're seeing in terms of the Trump effect isn't necessarily new. We just haven't seen it to this degree. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so noteworthy. Regarding the relationship between undocumented immigrants and bias incidents, I think it speaks to the need for education. There is actually a form of immigration-related relief available to undocumented individuals who are victims of crimes, including hate crimes, called the U visa. And it gives an incentive for individuals who are undocumented to actually report these crimes to law enforcement officials. And after they report and they cooperate in a related investigation, it actually allows them to obtain initially temporary immigration status and allows for the initiation of a green card. And so actually coming forward and reporting a hate crime or any crime by an undocumented individual can begin this journey towards legal immigration status. But unfortunately, many members of the undocumented community may not know that this avenue of relief is available to them. And so I think it speaks to the role of advocacy groups, as well as, consular officials or whatnot, to make sure that vulnerable communities are in fact educated in this respect. So we're well over time. Before ending, I do want to give each of you an opportunity to share some final thoughts. This just may be points that you want to reiterate or policy recommendations that you think are of utmost importance. And I'll go in reverse chronological order from that we started. So Brandon, let's start with you.
I think we've definitely touched on a world of topics that are so important. I think that people have been left with more than enough policy recommendations. So I'll just say, because I know a number of my students are on this call and we also get the opportunity to discuss it in class, they always say, what can I individually do? And we do think about those micro opportunities to report on social media platforms. We think about ways they can be involved in community issues, but I'll just exhort everyone, because I know that you're committed to these topics, to ensure that you're taking care of yourself throughout the process. Because if you're not able to do that and you're not able to be at the forefront of self-care, then you're not able to push back at so much of what's going on, whatever that may look like. And so I know my dog's here right now because he always brings some levity whenever we're talking about issues that must be treated with such gravitas. So thank you for letting me be part of the conversation, and just ensure as long as you're continuing this fight, you're also taking care of yourself and your loved ones, especially in these extraordinary times. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. Self-care, absolutely. Nadia.
Hi, thank you. I always try to end on a hopeful note, which can be difficult sometimes. But I will say one thing that I draw inspiration from, and I hope everyone who attended can too, are the stories of the families that have been through some of the most devastating situations in their life, and they're able to take that awful experience and turn it into something in a way to help others. And I see that with one of the most well-known families, unfortunately, who had to experience this, the Shepherd Foundation, or the Shepherd family, Dennis and Judy Shepherd. They're the parents of Matthew Shepherd, who was killed in '98. And for over 20 years, they have been traveling the country to share his story, to try and prevent what happened to their son from happening to another person. So, when days get tough, I always think back to families like that and get out of bed and put on my fighting hat.
Thank you, Nadia, for that motivational story. Janine?
2 quick tips. First, hold your local officials, police departments, law enforcement, hold their feet to the fire about hate crimes. Resist their call to say there's no hate crimes occurring here. Ask them what mechanisms they have in place to adequately address hate crimes that are happening in your community. Second, if you hear that someone has been victimized encourage them to report. Do what you can to help them feel safe in reporting to law enforcement, because law enforcement can only do so much. Those are my two. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was just thinking, I'm so glad you're able to join us. So thank you so much for all of your insightful observations. Domingo Garcia.
Again, thank you for having us. It's an important topic. Martin Luther King said the arc of history bends toward justice, and it really does. I think at the end of the day, every time we stand up against an injustice, every time we stand up against any act of bigotry or hatred, we are making America better and fulfilling its promise as a country that has equal opportunities for everybody. And irregardless of where we came from or how we got here or where we're at today, that everybody's an American who deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and equality.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian, you have the last word.
What a mistake that was, having you have the last word. But first of all, thank you all the panelists. They are wonderful. Couple of things. Just because you enact a hate crime law doesn't mean it's going to have gas in the tank and be able to drive. When I was a young lawyer starting out, and this was a guy named Bob Purvis with the National Institute Against Prejudice and Violence, and we sat down and he said, Brian, in all your zeal to get these laws passed, they're not self-executing. And then while at Stanford, did a lot of studies. And what I think we need to do, a few things. First of all, when it's an Arab, when it's a Muslim, when it's a transgendered person, when it's an immigrant, when it's someone who doesn't speak English and they are victimized, we all must stand up. And our center will always, always, always stand for that underdog, whether it was on September 12th or whether it's December 9th, 2020. So that's something. Don't just expect the advocacy groups to help. And one of the things about whatever success our center has had is we've always worked together with all these different groups, and like a fire truck, we went where the smoke was. So look at the beloved community, not just where you may be at, number one. Number two, set up structures, particularly at the local level, that will include police and government, and also get conservatives of goodwill involved. This is not a political issue. Religious liberty, addressing the scourge of white supremacy. These are moral issues for our nation, and we have to frame it in a way that we're all in there. And make sure that you keep pushing for legislation. Our State of Hate Commission attempt did not work last year. We're gonna go again here. And look at different states and see what they're doing. We're seeing more and more a shift to regionalization with regard to the anti-hate efforts. And in order to do that, we have to have a structure that includes prosecutors, judges, the local bar. Since we have lawyers here, the local bar can do a lot. And particularly if folks are multilingual, they have a law license, they can do a lot too, because they will know a little bit about the law when some folks who don't have these highfalutin degrees may not. So it's really important. Lawyers have an important role, and in particular in these individual communities. And lastly, I want to say this: hold these local politicians' feet to the fire, whether it's on the left saying we're not going to enforce enhancements. Well, that's how most hate crime laws are passed, because that's how the Supreme Court approved of them. Have not only these laws, but have a structure, and it must be sustained. Look at different jurisdictions, see what's being done, and those places that are reporting a high level of hate crimes, a lot of densely populated cities, for instance, like Boston, LA, and New York, actually, there are lessons to be learned from those places. Follow my stuff on Prof. Levin, because we have a lot of reports and a lot of suggestions, and reach out to groups and individuals of the kind that you see here, the lawyers, the researchers, the community folks who are out there doing it. And if you can get folks to do stuff gratis, for instance, a local bar association, one of the things that we're finding is it's the professionals, the police, the prosecutors, the judges. Just did something here in OC, I'm going to close with this, where the prosecutor said a judge was not really aware of the kind of law that was out there. And more, it's not only with regard to hate crime, but anti-militia laws as well, which are on the books in all 50 states. We have to have a mutual aid kind of system which will operate when the storm is hitting. You can't construct it at a time when we're responding to some catalytic event. Thank you and the American Bar Association for doing this. Any of the folks or groups involved, we are happy to help. And we've got a lot of work to do with a reinvigorated Justice Department, but don't just rely on the feds. It's got to be at the state and local level. Make anti-hate an issue politically.
Wonderful. So that's the perfect note to end on. I want to thank each of you, each of our esteemed panelists for joining us. This conversation would not have been as rich and enlightening as it has been without your involvement. So thank you. And I want to thank our participants for staying well over 30 minutes, the allotted time, which just speaks to how important this subject is. And it's really just the beginning of a conversation that we're starting, and we're going to be exploring these policy recommendations in a new column with the American Bar Association's ABA journal. So stay tuned for that. We hope to see you tomorrow afternoon for day 2 of our Social Policy Summit. The first webinar focuses on privacy concerns, and I look forward to seeing you then. So thank you, stay safe, and have